welcome along everybody. And this is the cancer seminar, of course, which is highly topical for a lot of people, simply because it's so rife in current society. It's just so rife, and we'll go over the statistics shortly and we'll talk about all that. But it's such a personal thing, and when I often do seminars in a large group, with a few hundred people, I often get people and put their hands up and say, look, who here knows someone with cancer or someone with heart disease or someone with diabetes? By the time you've got to diabetes, basically the entire room has had their hand up. It's that rife in society these days. So it's very sad what's happened. So tonight what we're going to talk about in the cancer seminar is initiation. What does initiation mean? What is cancer initiation? We're going to talk about promotion and how cancer promotes in the human body. We'll talk about progression and why that's the third stage, and then that leads to proliferation in the human body. And then we'll also talk about prevention, because one of the key things is not so much to dwell in, well, we've all got cancer and it's terrible, but let's dwell in, well, what do we do about it? How do we get cancer? What are the rates that we're expected to get? What can we do about it? How can we prevent it? How can we reverse it? And how can we treat it? So that's what we're going to go over tonight, is all the different aspects, and then really dwell in it. And I'll use breast cancer as an example. A bit later on we'll go right into breast cancer, because it's something that's very, very topical for New Zealand women. We have such high rates. So we'll go into that in a lot of detail about what you can do about it, what causes it, how you can prevent it, reverse it, treat it, all the different ways of dealing with it. So only 5 to 10% of all cancer cases can be attributed to genetic defects, while the remaining 90 to 95% have their roots in the environment and lifestyle. Cancer is a disease commonly believed to be preventable, and that study published in Pharmaceutical Research in 2008. So we know that even mainstream science is saying the same thing here, which is most cancer is not genetic, and most cancer is about the diet, the lifestyle, and the environment. And even 40 years before that, in the 1970s, the 70-page cancer review from the International War on Cancer that was started by President Nixon said genetics determines about 2 to 3% of total cancer risk. So even in the 1970s, we knew this information from 40 years ago. So whether you look at it from an epidemiological perspective or a scientific perspective, or professors or doctors or researchers, they're all saying the same thing. Now, sadly, when we look at the statistics, which is important to do when you talk about cancer, New Zealand leads the way. Right now, we have the #1 bowel cancer rates for women, of any group of women on the planet, anywhere in the world. We have the #1 rates. #2 obesity rates now, fighting between us and Australia. Pretty much changes about every 6 months with Australia and New Zealand, but we are either #2 or #3. And of course that directly leads into diabetes rates as well. So diabetes at #4, breast cancer currently at #5. So anywhere between 5 and 6 highest rates of breast cancer in the world, and heart disease of course at about #6. Now bowel cancer is the #3 most dangerous or deadly cancer worldwide, with about just over 1 million cases a year. And women's bowel cancer rates start, the highest is in New Zealand, second highest is America, third highest is Canada, and then the UK. So that's the order that they are around the world. And then when we have an interesting look at the women's meat intake around the world, we look at women's meat intake, #1 highest is New Zealand, second is America, third is Canada, and the fourth is the UK. Now is there a connection? Yes, there's a direct connection we know between meat and bowel cancer, and we'll go into that in some detail later on in the seminar. We'll cover that off. So cancer kills about 30% of us now, which is kind of sad in its own right. And the most common are lung, throat and bowel cancers. They're the most deadly, the most prolific. And they're of course directly caused by cigarettes, alcohol and obesity, the 3 big causes of that bunch of cancers. In 1900, which is 120 years ago or so, 112 years ago, it was pretty rare. Now it kills 1 in 8 people worldwide. So going from a disease that was very, very hard to track down to something that's annihilating 1 in 8 of us worldwide. And it's 1 in 4 in a lot of countries. Now men have 3 times the cancer rate that their grandfathers did. So we seem to think that we're getting healthier as we get older, and as technology gets better, we're actually not. Prostate cancer alone in New Zealand has risen 500% since 1980. And that's only over the last 32 years or so. Cancer is increasing at about 15% a year, every single year in the West. And it's dramatically increasing in that 20 to 34 age group. So I do a lot of presenting lately about the modern child is at risk around the world from obesity and diabetes. And of course one of the sad statistics of this is the younger and younger people getting cancer and dying at younger ages of cancer. And of course these are the cancers that we can prevent, and we'll talk about that as we go as well. From 1935 onwards, for about 75 years straight, we've had cancer rates going up every single year in the Western world. So a huge increase in cancer all over the planet. Margaret Iacumo, who is a doctor and a board certified radiologist and a breast cancer survivor, has a really interesting thing to say about cancer. Now remember, this is coming from a mainstream doctor who also treats people and works with people as a radiologist in cancer treatments, and herself has survived breast cancer. And she says, Why is it that our current methods of cancer treatment consist of toxic drugs and radiation therapy that are capable of increasing our risk for developing secondary cancers? More than 40 years after the war on cancer was declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971, we are not much closer to preventing the disease. The National Cancer Institute has spent some $90 billion during that time. If our cancer treatment puts us at risk for the development of a second cancer, there's something fundamentally flawed about that approach. Above all, do no harm should always be the guiding principle in the treatment of any disease, and especially in the case of cancer. And I think this really sums up well and truly where we've kind of gone wrong. We just don't put enough resources into the prevention of cancer, because so much cancer is preventable, completely and utterly preventable, just through changing our diet, our lifestyle, and our environment. And those are the three areas where we have the most power. So we look at what are we going to do when we get it, instead of, well, actually, I don't want to get it in the first place. So therefore, I'm going to put the work in now, in my 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, to stop it so that I don't get it in my 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that's where the power is. Global cancer is set to rise about 75% by 2030, in about 18 years. And this is the modern lifestyle cancers. This is where the growth is coming from. The lungs, the stomachs, breast, prostate cancers, those kind of cancers. And cancer specialist Dr. Michelle Holmes from Harvard University says the genes have been there for thousands of years. But if cancer rates are changing in a lifetime, that doesn't have much to do with genes. And it doesn't. Because if our genes haven't changed, and yet our disease rates are through the roof, then something has gone really wrong. Because why were we not getting these diseases earlier on? We weren't, because our diet, our lifestyle, and our environment were different. A cancer expert at Oxford University said about 2 weeks ago, it might be possible to avoid 50% of future cancers by persuading people everywhere to eat healthier, quit smoking, and exercise. So those key three simple basic things make such a difference to our longevity. Worldwide massive cancer deaths. Cancer is now the number 2 cause of death in Australia. About 30% of Australians now die from cancer. It's the number 2 killer in Europe. About 26%, 1 in 4 in Europe. In 2001, about 30% of Britons had cancer, and they had a lot of movement in Britain where they said, and they predicted that by the end of the 2000s, they got up to about 2010, they will have dropped the cancer rates. They're on top of it now. They've got it handled. Actually, what happened was by 2008, 42% of Britons were dying with cancer. So we went up from 33% to 42%. So there's no dropping off. There's actually increasing levels of death with cancer. The 2010 US President's Cancer Panel report expects that about 40% of Americans will have cancer when they die, or will die from cancer now. So it's consistently growing in America. And Ireland, their cancer rates will grow 80% by 2030. And of course, a huge part of that is from alcohol, because of course Ireland is drenched in alcohol. And we'll go later over exactly how alcohol causes cancer, what it does, how it works, and those aspects as well. In 2008, there was about 12 million cases of cancer in the world. By 2030, they're predicting about 22 million cases every single year. So we're expecting a doubling. So very, very sad when we've got what's going on. Being obese and overweight, of course, is a direct correlation. About 2.5 million Kiwis are currently overweight. In 1997, we weighed around 74 kilos. Now the average weight's about 85 kilos. That extra 10 kilos, of course, generally gets deposited around that area where it causes the most damage, that visceral fat that kills us. New Zealand now has 29% obesity rates and about 29% cancer rates. So what generally tends to happen is, and I've been studying this for a long time now, every year I've noticed that the obesity rate goes up. The following year, cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Then obesity, cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Obesity, cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Obesity, cancer, heart disease. So there's a direct following on that following year as the obesity rates go up. So follows the cancer rates. Obesity basically accentuates cancer growth by about 50%. So it dramatically raises your risk. It raises ovarian cancer risk by about 80%. And fatty liver now occurs in about half of people. Between 30 to 50% of New Zealand adults over the age of 50 have got a fatty liver. And of course, the liver is so important if you're wanting to transform your health, and particularly to beat cancer. And we'll go into why that's important later on as well. If you're obese at 10, you'll probably be dead in your 40s. If you're obese at 40, you're high risk of death in your 60s. Now, can that be reversed? Of course it can. Absolutely it can. It's been shown over and over again. But simply put, the more overweight you're carrying, particularly around that middle section, the higher your risk of early death, and particularly cancer. So if we look at the British Journal of Cancer and Cancer Research UK, they put out a study in 2011, which is a really, really good study, because they really looked at what are these key causes of cancer and how many cancers can be prevented. And of course, what they found was about 40%. The top 4 causes are smoking, obesity, a lack of fruits and vegetables, and smoking and alcohol. So these simple things here, each one of these we have complete control over. And even at conservative estimates, and this is very conservative by the way, even at conservative estimates, we're looking at about 40% of cancer can be annihilated just if people ate less, ate better, didn't drink alcohol, didn't smoke, and got more exercise, and ate a plant-based whole food diet. So simple little things like that come together to completely transform your cancer risk. Cancer cause awareness also is very low. When you talk to people, even cancer survivors or people with cancer, in 2011 the Australian Cancer Council survey looked at 3,000 cancer patients and actually asked them, what is it that causes cancer? What do you think that causes cancer? And 6% said smoking, 3% said alcohol, and less than 1%, less than half of 1% said that it was to do with the diet. Now this is people, 3,000 people, educated cancer patients, having no idea that diet had anything to do with cancer. And 6% said smoking, when we know that smoking causes 85% of all lung cancer deaths, which is the number one cause of cancer death on the planet. 85% caused by smoking. And yet 3,000 people, out of 3,000 people, 6% mentioned smoking. So that's so out of whack as we are in terms of what do we understand about what causes cancer. So what can we do about cancer? What is it we can actually do? How do we prevent cancer? How do we break the cycle of cancer, particularly the generational cycle? And how do we stop our children dying of cancer? Because the average age of cancer is dropping every year in the West. Every single year it's dropping. So how do we prevent it with our children? We change our diets, we change our lifestyle, we change our environment. They are the three things that we have control over. And they are the three things that have the most power over our genetic expression. And your genetic expression dictates your entire health profile. So how does cancer grow? We have to go right back to the beginning if we're going to understand what cancer is and how it works. It starts with initiation, and then it goes into promotion, and then it goes into progression. So there's three basic stages of cancer: the initiation period, the promotion period, and then the progression period. And the progression period is the period that you never want to get to, because that's when it really starts to get out of control. So the initiation starts with a carcinogen. So I've got some examples here of carcinogens: cigarettes, alcohol, meat, or sugar. They're four classic examples of carcinogens. So we bring a cigarette into the room. If we're all sitting here in the room, someone comes in and lights a cigarette, that carcinogenic chemical, as soon as it hits your smelling, as soon as you can smell it and it hits your taste buds, which of course happen as soon as you can smell something, you can taste it, same buds in the brain, same way it works. As soon as you can smell it, that's the carcinogenic material starting to happen. As soon as you can smell it, that happens. That's called secondhand cigarette smoke. And secondhand cigarette smoke is as deadly as first-hand cigarette smoke. Don't be under any illusion. So is third-hand cigarette smoke, which a lot of people don't talk about or don't understand. Third-hand cigarette smoke is when you go into a pub, say, and no one smoked in there for a while, but you can smell it in the walls and on the floor and on the carpet. That's third-hand cigarette smoke. And that is enormously impacted with sudden infant death syndrome, with a lot of childhood diseases to do with the respiratory, where the babies, of course, are crawling around on the floor or lying on the floor on the bottom of a cot, have to breathe in what's there. And of course what's there is all the carcinogens that have dropped to the floor or dropped into their cot or dropped into the car seat that they're sitting in, and they can't do anything about. So the first thing is we initiate a carcinogen. That carcinogen then starts to mutate our ability to deal with it, and then we start to get sick. So the first thing is a carcinogen is introduced. The body then absorbs it into the blood. That's what the body does. Of course, it's washing everything all the way through. And then the body transports it to the cells. And the cells are where we grow. So once it gets to the cell, it changes and it bonds to some cellular DNA, and it causes damage. And it's this damage to the DNA that really starts to cause the trouble. So when we look at groups of people like the Okinawans, and we'll talk about them a bit later on the Loma Lindas, and the people that live these long, healthy lives without carcinogens, without cancer, they actually lower the amount of antagonists and cancer-causing chemicals and things in their environment. So they specifically have a lifestyle which lowers all the things that we know are carcinogens and raises all the things in their environment which we know protect you against cancer. So they have this juggling act where they are lowering the antagonists and raising the anti-cancer promoters. So we get cellular DNA damage, and this damaged DNA then alters and turns a normal cell into a cancer cell or carcinogenic cell. So we get the initiation of the cancer-causing substance or the carcinogen. That then changes our cells, DNA alters, and then a good cell turns into what we call a bad cell. Now the mitochondria, you might have heard this in Star Wars, they use the mitochondria about where the Jedi get their power from, the mitochondria in the cells, no? Anyway, so Jedi talk about the mitochondria inside the cells, and that's actually factual. What we have is we have mitochondria are the energy producing power plants inside your cells. So each cell has got this tiny little power plant called a mitochondria. Now normal healthy body cell uses oxygen to convert glucose into energy. Now where do we get glucose from? Our food. Right? So we eat our fruits and vegetables, the body converts that glucose into glycogen, which becomes body energy, and we use that glycogen to fuel the body. So that glucose that we have, a normal human body converts that with oxygen. It uses the oxygen, converts the glucose into energy. That's why we breathe oxygen. It's very important that we breathe oxygen. Without enough oxygen, the cell converts that glucose into energy by fermenting it. So if you haven't got enough oxygenation in the cells, and this is why we talk about oxygen being so important in an oxygen-rich diet, which of course is a plant-based whole food diet based around fruits and vegetables and nuts, seeds, whole grains and legumes, is an oxygen-rich diet. If you do not have enough oxygen, the cell will convert the glucose by fermenting it. Now what happens is when you get that fermentation inside a cell rather than outside the cell, which is where we want to have fermentation, when we ferment foods before we eat them, the acid byproduct lowers the cell's pH. So the cell's pH, of course, is so important on whether you live or die and how acid or alkaline you get. So the cell pH gets altered, and this destroys the DNA and the RNA ability to control cell division. So cell division is when the cell starts to grow out of control and starts to proliferate. That's when the growth happens. So of course, a lack of oxygen in the body, of course oxygen is caused by exercise, by diet, by deep breathing. A lack of oxygen means that the cells can't convert that glucose. It starts to ferment the glucose, and the side product is the lactic acid, which then alters your DNA and RNA. Cancer cells then amplify the mitochondria mechanism by 5 to 10 times. And this is where we get, and you talk about the proliferation of cancer. So that's how cancer then starts to grow out of all control, because you get that fermentation happening, a lack of oxygen, and cancer loves a lack of oxygen. It's very important. Cancer cells use the sugar, the glucose, and what we call very effective insulin regulators to build and bring in large amounts of glucose through the cell wall. So the cancer cell starts to suck the glucose through the cell wall and grow and reproduce the cancer cell. Then you get the proliferation. Now cancer cells need 10 to 20 times more sugar than normal cells. 10 to 20 times. Now how much more sugar are we eating now than we used to? 10 to 20 times. And of course we've got cancer rates exploding all over the world. So the cancer is fed by the sugar. And cancer cells have an anaerobic metabolism, which is almost zero oxygen. So your cancer cells don't want any oxygen, and this is when promotion occurs. So when this cell divides and creates another daughter cell or a seedling cell, then this genetic damage is reproduced, and that's when you get promotion in the human body. So you go from the initiation, which is the initial damage, then you start to get promotion and the cells start to reproduce themselves. Promotion is controlled by the health of your biological terrain. Now what that means is, it's a technical term of saying by your health profile. So your biological terrain is how healthy your cells are. So we all get cancer cells starting to grow all the time. This happens all the time. We get mutations every day. You know, cancer is constantly popping up in the body, but what happens is our immune system jumps on it. Our immune system says, a cancer cells, grabs it, flushes it, puts it in the liver, gets rid of it. So the immune system takes care of it, and that's our point of defense, and that's why we want to have a strong, healthy immune system. And of course, we've talked a lot about the immune system and how to have it strong with your diet and your sleeping and routine and things. However, the sugar that's been feeding the cancer has also been killing the liver. And this is that double aspect of cancer growth, where you get the sugar. If you've got high levels of sugar coming into the body, not only is it feeding that mitochondria growth and getting the growth of cancer cells out of control, but of course the cancer loves all that extra glucose because it's fermenting and starts to grow and it needs more and more sugar and you're eating more sugar. But it's also killing your liver. And the liver is the one thing that will save your life if you get cancer, is a healthy liver. So of course the sugar is damaging and growing the DNA and growing the bad cells, and it's also killing your liver, which is the very thing that will actually get rid of the cancer. So cancer loves sugar and your liver hates it. Absolutely hates it. It's why when you eat too much sugar you feel sick and you want to have a bitter food, and why you crave green vegetables. And as many of you will notice, now that you've got used to eating much better, you'll actually get to the point where if you don't eat greens for a couple of days, you actually crave them. It's the liver yelling out, I need more greens. Because there's two things that will transform your liver health: bitter foods and green foods. They're the two foods that do it. And that's why whenever you're looking at any kind of cancer treatment, it's based around leafy green vegetables, lots of them. So that's why we need lots and lots of them. And of course, they're incredibly rich in oxygen, which is the other thing we need to feed the body. 30% of adults have fatty liver disease, 50% of adults over the age of 50 have it. And a weak liver means a much higher cancer risk. So if you're growing cancer in the body and you've got a weak liver, you're in trouble. So we know that most cancer is about 97% preventable. Most of the scientists around the world agree. At the lower level it's about 80%, at the higher level it's about 98%. And pre-bowel cancer is called constipation. And it's another reason why I go on and on and on and on about measuring your bowel motions, getting yourself regular, making sure you're going 3 times a day or working towards it. because, of course, bowel cancer is something that kills so many Kiwis. You know, it's the number one cause of, number one rates of bowel cancer in New Zealand women. New Zealand men, number 3 in the world. So we have the third highest rates in the men and the number one rates highest in women. And of course, so much of it's to do with our low fibre diet. And of course, that builds constipation and it builds bowel cancer. Pre-cancer initiation is preventable through avoiding the known carcinogens, so the things that we know cause it in the body. Promotion is reversible depending on the environment of the body, and how you prevent and unpromote cancer in the body is by changing your diet. Fresh fruits and vegetables are anti-promoters, and they use antioxidants to interfere with cancer growth. So when you've got a cancer cell growing and it's got a little radio signal that goes, come in, other cancer cell, we need you to come over here, and the other cancer goes, yeah, and they're trying to talk and grow so they can replicate and grow in the human body. The little thing that smashes the communication cell, the cell phone signal, is the anti-promoters. They're called antioxidants. And what they do is they stop the oxidization. How they do that and where you get them from is fruits and vegetables. So they interfere. They knock out that cell communication. And that's called free radicals. And of course, the free radical damage is what we see on an apple. When you chop an apple and you leave it out and it goes brown, that's free radical damage and oxygenation of the apple. That's when that starts to cause it to go brown. So what we have with fruits and vegetables is the antioxidants protect that, and they stop the cancer cell proliferation in the human body, which is why fruits and vegetables protect you from cancer. So what are the fastest growing cancers worldwide? Of course, they are what we call Western fat cancers. That's what they've been labelled. Liver, kidney, breast, bowel, and prostate cancer. They're the ones that are growing out of control. The other thing to remember with cancer is with oxygen, of course. We need a lot of oxygen if you want to prevent cancer. Cancer has only one prime cause. It's the replacement of normal oxygen respiration of the body's cells by an anaerobic or oxygen deficient cell respiration. This is Dr. Otto Warburg, Nobel Prize winner. He won a Nobel Prize for this discovery, which is that cancer cells feed with low oxygen. They don't like oxygen. They want an oxygen deficient environment, anaerobic. So normal cells need oxygen. Of course, that goes without saying. Human beings live on oxygen. It's really important. So normal cells grow and proliferate with good levels of oxygen. Cancer cells despise oxygen, absolutely despise them. They don't want oxygen, they want a low level of oxygen. So cancer cells have an anaerobic mechanism, and your pH levels need to be slightly alkaline to prevent cancer growth in the human body. And you'll see a lot of different things tonight as we talk through from other seminars, and you'll start to see the connection between acid alkaline, between raw fruits and vegetables. All these different things start to come together when you talk about cancer, because they all actually feed into either getting cancer or lowering cancer risk in the human body. The acid alkaline balance. We know about that. We've had a seminar on that. The ocean balance is about 8.3% pH balance, and fish need water to be pH balanced. You know that if you've got a fish tank, it's slightly out, all the fish die. It's really important to have the right kind of balance. And plants require that the pH of the soil is really balanced, otherwise you won't get healthy plants. Even our environment is a delicate balance between the two. You've got the acidic carbon dioxide, you've got alkaline oxygen, even in our environment. So what is the liquid that we live in and that feeds all our organs and travels right through the entire body? I mean, we live in a liquid, and the liquid's called blood. Now that pH balance needs to be exactly finely tuned, and the body has an amazing adaptive mechanisms to make sure that the blood stays at the right pH level. And if it doesn't, of course, it starts to suck minerals and things out of the other parts of the human body, and you start to get sick. So what do we know about cancer? Well, we know that oxidative stress drives cancer growth up. We know the more oxidative stress you have, the more cancer growth you have. We know DNA damage drives cancer growth up. As we talked about with initiation, once the initiation happens, you get DNA damage. The more DNA damage you have, the more it proliferates and the more you get cancer. The other thing we know is that refined sugars, animal fats, animal proteins, and alcohol cause oxidative stress and DNA damage. So they cause the growth of oxidative stress and DNA damage in the human body. So we know that broccoli, as an example, lowers oxidative stress by about 22%. Just a couple of heads of broccoli a week and you'll dramatically lower your oxidative stress. And again, it's one of the reasons why those groups of people, particularly in the Asian cultures, they eat so many cruciferous vegetables every day. And they lower their risk of cancer. And of course, they have some of the lowest bowel cancer and breast cancer, prostate cancer, liver cancer rates on the planet in those areas where they eat the highest amount of things like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, all those wonderful cruciferous vegetables. DNA damage is also 20% less after eating fruit, and that goes on for about 24 hours. It's one of those reasons I recommend eating a lot of fruit as well, and fruit is your snack. If you really want to give yourself lower levels of DNA damage, you get those antioxidants, of course, from your fruits and vegetables. So they literally can be measured lowering your oxidative stress and bringing your DNA damage down just by eating a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. And cancer rates are 10 times higher where the least amount of fruit is eaten. So you can go into different countries around the world and actually see exactly where the cancer rates are due to the amount of fruits and vegetable content. So Professor Max Parkin from Cancer Research UK, on the most comprehensive diet and lifestyle cancer study ever done in England, as published by the British Journal of Cancer in December 2011, said, and I'll quote directly from his review, "We didn't expect to find that eating fruit and vegetables would prove to be so important in protecting men against cancer." And it's quite an out there thing to say for a mainstream professor when he's talking about men's cancer and he's talking about all this research, and he says, you know what? It's all about fruits and vegetables, which is staggering. Even though we know that's the case, but actually to hear that in the mainstream press is quite extraordinary. And when you look at it, you can actually, even after looking at professors saying it and scientists and doctors saying it, you can go, well, look, let's have a look at the countries that have the highest rates of cancer in the world and the countries that have the lowest rates. What do they eat? So we look at the country with the highest rates of cardiovascular disease, CVD is cardiovascular disease, or cancer rates in the world, is America. They have obesity rates at 32%, highest cancer rates in the world. Now, Loma Linda and the Seventh-day Adventists have the lowest rates in America. So when you look at America as a country, you've got the highest rates of cancer. However, the lowest rates exist in this one little section of America where they have very high levels of Seventh-day Adventists. And of course, part of the Seventh-day Adventists is they have a very high fruit and vegetable intake, vegetarian. And of course, they don't eat meat, they don't smoke, they don't have alcohol or sugar or coffee. So of course, we have this from a religious background, giving you a diet and lifestyle changes in your environment which lower the amount of cancer. So what are these people doing? It's a great example of, well, look, they're taking the antagonists which give you cancer, your meat, your smoking, your sugar, your coffee, your alcohol, and they're removing that from their environment. So if you remove the environmental initiators which cause the initiation of cancer, you immediately lower your risk. But then what they're doing is dramatically increasing their fruit and vegetable intake, which means that protects them from cancer. So even if they do get a bit of initiation, the amount of nutrition they're getting is protecting them via the antioxidants. So they're doing both. They're lowering their risk and increasing their chances of a long, healthy life. Now, the interesting thing here is the genes that are at the growth of cancer also seem to be very influential in longevity. So you get the same group of people with the lower cancer rates live much longer lives without getting sick. So there's a double banger here. So lower heart disease, lower cancer, much longer life without being sick. It doesn't seem to be that they have long lives with cancer or long lives with heart disease. No, they don't. They have long lives without. So we know that there's a crossover between the genes that give you longevity, but also lower your cancer and heart disease risks seem to work together. And of course, calorie restriction and eating less is a key part of that as well. It all works in. So when we look at this, we see there's 10 times more centenarians in Loma Linda than there is across the rest of America on average. So imagine going to an area where there's 10 times more people hitting 100, and you go across the border, and there's only one hitting 100 for every 10 across the border. It's enormous. So then we look at Japan. So we've had a look at America, which is the sickest country in the world. Then we look at the healthiest country in the developed world is Japan. Obesity rates at 3%. But when you look at Ireland and America and Japan, one of the interesting things is when Japan, the latest numbers came out, because Japan has been embracing the Western lifestyle, things are starting to change in Japan. They're starting to have supersized servings. A lot of the young kids there like the baseball caps and to follow the American way of life. So what's happening is the American way of life is now influencing Japan. And their obesity rate was 2.5 last year. It went up to 3% and there was an outcry. So imagine an obesity rate going from 2.5 to 3% and there's an outcry, whereas America goes from 31 to 32 and no one bats an eyelid. And it's 10 times higher. Extraordinary. So you can see that even the culture there, they have a different way of seeing things, which is really good. It keeps them very healthy. Now, when you look at Japan, they have the lowest levels of cancer in the developed world. Even in Japan, the two areas that have the lowest levels of all are Nagano and Okinawa. They have the lowest rates of cancer in all the different provinces of Japan. So when you look at what those two provinces do differently, they have the highest level of fruits and vegetables, often eaten between 9 and 17 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. Now, for some of us, we might eat 1 serving a day. They eat 9 to 17 servings. So an enormous amount of servings of fruits and vegetables. Plant-based whole food diet, no coffee. And one of the things that cross over here, of course, is a plant-based diet, no meat and no coffee. And of course, we know what coffee does with the human body. So the other interesting thing about Okinawa is they have the highest levels of centenarians of any group of people in the world. Number 1, rates of longevity, lowest levels of cancer, highest intake of fruits and vegetables. So the healthiest country, highest levels of fruits and vegetables, the lowest levels of cancer. The unhealthiest country, highest levels of fruits and vegetables, lowest levels of cancer. So we know there's a direct correlation between the two. Even the science is saying the same thing. So when we look at cancer and drugs, that's another thing that we need to cover off tonight. Most medical treatments for cancer, as we know, are responsible for secondary life-threatening cancers. And we know that even the doctors will tell you part of the side effect of this cancer treatment may be a secondary cancer. Commonly used chemotherapeutic agents and ionizing radiation dramatically increase your risk of death. And cancer treatments can be as devastating and deadly as the cancer itself. We know that, and that's the trade-off that you have and the choice you have to make if you've got cancer as to whether you want to go down that route or not. There is a risk to it. As Margaret Edson said so eloquently in her play about this, my treatment imperils my health. And it's a wonderful way to sum it up. You know, how do we get a treatment that doesn't imperil that? And that quote earlier on from the breast cancer survivor, who's a doctor and a radiologist, she talks about exactly that. Why is it that the treatments are more deadly than the cancer itself? So the US National Cancer Institute budget dedicates 3 amounts of money to treating cancer each year. And this is quite illuminating when you start to look at, well, how do we see cancer? And what do we do? Well, the US National Cancer Institute budget is $2 billion to basic science every year, where we're looking for a cure for cancer. Now, that's been going on, by the way, for about 40 years, $2 billion a year. So when we look at $1.3 billion, they spend every year on treatment of cancer, and that is those treatments you get, and just $232 million on prevention. So when we look at, we know that the basic science tells us that 80% at the lowest level, 97% at the highest level of cancer is preventable, and yet the tiniest amount of money from the funding goes towards prevention. You start to see how we've got the model slightly wrong. And that's why when you start to work with the professors and scientists, they say, this needs to change. The prevention message is what needs to become the biggest spend. And we just need to start competing with the McDonald's and the takeaway bars and all that in terms of prevention messages, because that's where we have the power. Frederick L. Hoffman started the American Cancer Society, the ACS, stating, and I quote, diet was the way to prevent and treat cancer. That's actually what the society was founded on, was that diet is the way to treat and prevent cancer, not drug therapy. Now, does the cut, burn or poison actually work? Well, not effectively. Given that we've got cancer growth for 75 years, we're not having that much success in that area. The total American Cancer Society budget for 2008 was about $1 billion. About 1 million of that was for the CEO, and about half of the rest, about $500 million, was on salaries. So when we start to look at, well, where's the money going? You look at $1 billion towards the ACS, you look at half it actually going just on salaries. It leaves the other half to be broken up in all the other areas. Pfizer alone, which is just one drug company in the world, excitedly launched their predictions for drug turnover for cancers. And they predicted that they would actually be making about $11 billion by 2018. This is one company on one mixture of products for one disease. $11 billion a year turnover. That's what we're heading for, which is a shocker. That's only 6 years away. That was from their annual report. So when we start to then look at independent cancer research, if we start to go, well, look, why don't we look at some of the independent research? And the World Cancer Research Fund, WCRF, was set up to investigate the food links to cancer. And what they did was in 2003, they had a whole lot of scientists look, and they had some of the world's leading scientists look at over 1,000 different studies on cancer and diet. And this is basically all the studies in the medical literature. So everything that we know that connects diet and cancer, they got all that information together and they all looked at it. They looked at all the research. And in 2007, after 5 years of looking at it, the American Institute for Cancer Research and scientists from the Imperial College of London released their findings. So this is 5 years of looking at over 1,000 studies about cancer and food. What did they come up with? In 2011, it was then rechecked, reviewed again, and then an independent expert panel looked at it again and made another judgment. So this has been peer-reviewed and peer-reviewed and peer-reviewed by independent researchers without an agenda. And it's quite fascinating what they came up with. This is the most comprehensive, evidence-based research on cancer and diet ever undertaken in history. I'm going to say that again so you get a sense of it. It's the most comprehensive, evidence-based, as in show me the proof. Here is the proof. Okay, evidence-based research on cancer and diet ever done in history. Over 1,000 studies. What did they come up with? What was their basic review? Number one, processed meats increase your risk of all cancer, especially bowel cancer. Number two, no amount of processed meat is safe for human health. That's no amount. Notice they didn't say a small amount, they said no amount. And this is direct quotes from their review. I haven't written this myself. Number three, the more meat you eat, the more heart disease, strokes, heart attacks, cancer, and coronary problems you will have. This is directly from their summary of the most intensive, comprehensive study on cancer and diet ever done in history. So I've put some pictures here of some processed meats. Of course, the charred meats, the processed meats, which we know are made up of all kinds of additives, the salamis, the hamburgers, the hot dogs, the pizzas, those kind of things. So bowel cancer and fibre. Another way of looking at this is if we look at, well, let's look at some epidemiological studies. And if you look at the Czech Republic, They eat a low-fibre, meat-rich diet. And we know that the colon cancer rates, death rates, are about 34 per 100,000 of bowel cancer. So we look at the Indians on a plant-based whole food diet, and their rates of death are about 0.63 per 100,000. So an enormous difference. If you look at 34 deaths per 100,000 versus 0.63, not even one death per 100,000 of colon cancer. The Czech men living on the modern low-fibre, meat-based diet have 54 times the colon cancer rates of Indian men living on a high-fibre, plant-based whole food diet. 54 times. Now, the really interesting thing about this, of course, is that there's 1.2 billion Indians and there's 10 million Czechs. So the Czechs have 120 times less population, yet they have 54 times higher per capita rates of colon cancer. It's extraordinary. So 120 times more people have one case per 54 cases over here, and there's 120 times more people. It's utterly and completely in reverse. So completely out of control. Even when you look at Africans, and you take Africans, it's basically non-existent. You don't get bowel diseases in fit rural Africans living on a plant-based whole food diet and squatting. And of course, we've gone over squatting and how important it is for bowel motions with squatting to get that part of the body working well. Almost non-existent if you're actually going number 2s the way that we're designed to. When you look at USA-based Africans, when we take the Africans, and of course they become African Americans, they move to America, they have the highest colon cancer rates of any ethnic group in America. Number 1, confirmed again in March this year by World Health Statistics. They have the number 1 rates of any group in the States, and yet it's non-existent in their home country when they're living on a plant-based whole food diet. So it's extraordinary when you can actually move someone. It's not about genetics. You start to see it's nothing to do with genetics, because you can move a group of people and they completely and utterly change their disease profile. Meat equals PAH equals cancer. Grilled meat contains one of the most potent carcinogens available. It's called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAH. If you want to know all about the research, have a look on the internet, punch it in and see what comes up. But what basically happens is when fire touches your meat, and we've talked about this earlier, it liquefies and drips into the fire. The fire then vaporizes it into PAH-containing flames. This creates cancer-causing compounds which then rise in the form of gas and then stick onto the meat, and then we eat it. The thing to remember about PAH is when chemists and pharmaceutical companies want to inject and create cancer in animals, they always inject them with PAH because it is the most effective and immediate way to give them cancer. They actually inject it. They inject an intensified version of PAH, whereas we actually eat it. And we wonder why our bowel cancer rates are so high. And of course, Kiwis barbecue everything. We cook it over the fire, we get the PAH going into the human body. So what happens is when you want to create cancer in an organism, you inject it with PAH. That's what they do, but we eat it. So our bowel cancer rates very, very high. So a meat-based diet, animals were given cancer-causing chemicals. They're probably given PAH actually, while fed the modern animal-based diet, and within weeks 90% developed breast cancer and 60% developed liver cancer. So we know injecting this kind of chemical will give you high levels of cancer. We know that, bowel cancer, liver cancer. However, the animals were fed the same cancer-causing chemicals. Another group of animals eating a plant-based whole food diet developed no cancer whatsoever. And this is documented by researchers. No cancer eating a plant-based diet while fed the same cancer-causing chemicals as a group fed an animal-based modern diet, high in sugar, high in animal foods. They develop the cancers very, very quickly within 90 days, 3 months. So, colon cancer in meat. We know that meat is closely associated with colon cancer more than anything else. We know that. There's a direct relationship. There's no debate about that in the science at all anymore. Meat massively increases your colon cancer rate. If you eat meat, it triples your colon, your stomach, your prostate cancer risk compared to vegetarians. Women eating meat have about a 250% increased risk of colon cancer. We know that colon cancer survivors, even if you actually get over colon cancer, then you start eating meat again, your rate immediately triples for dying again against vegetarians. And eating chicken is the same thing, by the way. Triples your colon cancer risk, so don't think chicken's any better. It's not. It gives you the same risk as meat. So we know that as a direct relationship to bowel cancer. The meat intake is very, very high. It's been shown in many, many studies overseas. And of course, New Zealand is a classic case of an epidemiological study where we've got the highest intake of meat and the highest rates of bowel cancer. So even as a country, we show it from an epidemiological perspective. This is from a scientific perspective. So it doesn't matter which way you look at it, it's the same result. Basically, if you eat meat, high levels of it, you'll die young. If you look at the groups around the world, the Eskimos, the Laplanders, the Kenyan Maasai, the Inuit Greenlanders, the Russian Kyrgyz tribes eat the most meat in the world, and they have the lowest life expectancy. So we know the same thing happens there. They often die when they're barely 30 years old. If you get to 60, and you're a Maasai, you're looked at as an absolute godfather. You looked at this incredible ancient person at 60. Of course, with us, we consider 60 about middle-aged. The Maasai really live beyond age 60. Very, very rare that it happens. So the groups with the highest levels of meat, of course, live the shortest lives. So this is when we get into, we start to look at also movement with cancer. So when we look at cancer, I've got a picture here of a chair. And when we read what it said, it sums it up really well. We sit while eating our breakfast. We sit while we drive on the way to work. We sit down behind our desk all day. Then when we go home, we sit in the car on the way home. And then when we get home, we sit and watch TV. Because so we have this whole process of sitting. Now we know that sitting drives cancer growth. We know that. Sitting is a very effective way to get sick. The human body is amazingly adaptable. And what happens is when you do something over and over again, that's what the body adapts to. So that's why when you sprint a lot, you get very good at sprinting. If you walk a lot, you get very healthy at walking. If you do pull-ups, what do you know? You can do more and more pull-ups. Same thing with sitting. If you sit all the time, you become a sitting machine. The body literally changes its shape. It starts to store its fat here. It starts to prefer here. The back starts to get out of shape. And we have breakdowns of all the body systems. And the fat-burning gene turns off. You lose all your fat-burning ability when you're sitting all the time. It's why one of my golden rules is if you sit for an hour, you must stand up and walk for a few minutes. Just 5 minutes an hour, get up and go for a walk. Really important. Because when you really start to look at what we do during the day, most days, you start to see, and it's really well summed up on this particular slide, which is from the American Institute of Cancer Research, you start to look at the 4 differences between typical lifestyles, either moving a lot or moving not much at all. And what we've got on this slide is the grey indicates sedentary. A break indicates when you stop doing what you're doing and maybe stand up. And green is when you're doing exercise. And as you can see here, Joe at the top, he sits a little bit in the morning, but then he stands while he works, and then he walks, and then he leans over and gets some water. He has a break with water, then he stands some more, goes for a walk and a break, stands while he walks, goes for a bike ride afterwards, and then stands a bit, then maybe watches a bit of TV and sleeps. His cancer risk indicator is very, very low because his daily activity is based around standing and moving. Then you look at Kim, and she does a little bit of weights. Kim's into her weights, and she does a bit of movement, but she sits a lot more when she works. Does a bit more, but then sits a bit more at the end of the day. And she's got about an even breakdown. So again, it raises the cancer risk. And then Mike, who's slightly different again, sits more, drives to work, sits more at work, drives on the way home, doesn't do any exercise after work. He's got a higher risk of cancer. And then you look at the bottom, which is Anne, and she has a very high risk because, of course, she is that classic example of sitting all day. And that increases your cancer risk directly. So even the American Institute for Cancer Research, very mainstream organizations, know that there is direct proof and science behind sitting raises your risk of cancer dramatically. So again, one of my tips that I always try to give, if you sit for an hour, walk for 5 minutes. It's just a simple thing to do, but it absolutely changes you. And when you walk, you get creative. Of course, the brain downloads, you get better solutions to problems, things like that. So important to move as well. Another thing that's important with cancer is sunlight. Most cancer tumours cannot grow or function in the presence of vitamin D. Vitamin D is highly, highly anti-cancer. Vitamin D influences the action of genes that regulate the proliferation and growth of cancer cells. So vitamin D is one of those things that influences gene and genetic growth of cancer in the human body. It's why vitamin D has been held as a miracle. You know, miracle vitamin, everyone's got to have more vitamin D. It's very, you know, we know that in Scotland, they have the lowest levels of vitamin D in the world. And recently they've done a review and the government's now recommending 3 times the amount of vitamin D that it used to recommend because, of course, multiple sclerosis rates in Scotland are the highest in the world. And, of course, we know vitamin D directly rates to multiple sclerosis. All around the world, the further away from the equator, the less sunlight we get, the higher the rates. So vitamin D has a huge influence on the action of genes. Vitamin D reduces your risk of skin cancer and as many as 16 other types of cancer, particularly breast cancer, colon, prostate, bladder, ovarian, and rectal cancer. So there's enormous influence that vitamin D has in the human body. Now, most of us are vitamin D deficient in the West. We just don't get enough. Because, of course, you can get vitamin D from 2 sources. One is sunlight directly on the skin, about anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes a day directly on the skin. The other one is vitamin D-rich foods. And, of course, we're not eating nearly enough vitamin D-rich foods as well. So when Japanese women moved to America, their breast cancer rates skyrocket. Now, this was shown after the Second World War, where there was a lot of studies done where they really started to see the difference between migration and genetics. And what happened was, after the Second World War, lots of Japanese women moved from Japan to Hawaii to live in Hawaii. And what happened was those women had genetic siblings and aunties and uncles and family members that stayed in Japan. But the ones that moved to Hawaii within a decade were as overweight as Americans and as sick as Americans, getting American diseases. Now, there's a whole lot of key factors to this. It's all about the diet, the lifestyle, and the environment. But one of the key things that Japanese women would do in Japan is when they would go out to get together for a catch-up, they would go down to the local store with cafe and have a catch-up over some food. Now, the local store catch-up in a lot of the traditional areas in Japan around that time, they would serve eel. Eel was considered one of the delicacies, so you'd go and have an eel with someone. So we would say, let's go and have a coffee. They'd say, let's go and have an eel. So they go and have an eel. Now, what is the richest single food source of vitamin D on the planet? Eels. So they would go every day and meet up with their friends and eat eel, which is high levels of vitamin D, which would lower their risk of cancer. Now, alongside that, they would eat less and exercise more, and they'd do all these other things. But one of those critical things they measured was the levels of vitamin D in Japanese women in Japan very, very high, because, of course, they work and live outside as well, and they get the vitamin D from the sunlight and from their diet. However, when they moved to America, they'd meet for a coffee instead of an eel, and, of course, they'd go to McDonald's or whatever, and they'd eat foods that literally would suck the vitamin D out of their body, stress their immune system, and as soon as your immune system is stressed, it sucks vitamin D out of the cells, because vitamin D runs your immune system. So again, you're talking about Loma Linda. When we talked about the centenarians in Loma Linda, they have the highest levels of fruits and vegetables, lowest levels of cancer, and they remove the antagonists that cause cancer. Then you look at Japanese women. In Japan, highest levels of vitamin D-rich foods and good lifestyle environment, living outside in the sun, lowest levels of cancer. These same people, without changing their genetics, move to America, and suddenly they remove the vitamin D intake, they remove the outside lifestyle, and they increase all the crap food which sucks the vitamin D, which raises their risk for cancer. So you take a group of people, doesn't matter their genetics, and you move them into a different diet, lifestyle, and environment, and their entire disease profile changes. And that's how we see the migration studies working. That happens all around the world. Same thing. So what does sunlight do exactly? Well, it runs your immune system response. The thing to remember about sunlight and vitamin D is the human body, every cell in the human body has a vitamin D modulator and receptor, but the immune system particularly runs on vitamin D modulation. The modulators in your immune system is run on vitamin D. That's what protects you, and that's why the children often every year that don't get sick in winter have been running around outside, because they've stored the vitamin D, and that's the design, is that we go through spring, summer, and autumn storing vitamin D, and then we go into hibernation. And the vitamin D gets stored in the human body, and then we call on it as we get sick through the winter. So as the immune system requires vitamin D, it pulls it out of the system. That's why vitamin D is fat soluble. It gets stored in the fat cells and then is required when we get sick in winter, which is why you get some people that constantly get sick in winter, particularly if they avoid the sun in the summer, because they don't store enough vitamin D in the body. Now, you can get it from sunlight or from food, either way. It runs the immune system of most animals on the planet, and you'll know most animals on the planet, and I think I've told you the story. I go walking in Cornwall Park, and whenever I go up there in the morning, all the animals naturally come out in the morning and they spend the day in the sun. But what you'll notice is when the sun gets too hot, all the animals come out of the sun and they go in the shade. They don't stay out in the sun and put chemicals all over them and wear sunglasses and continue to bake. No, they don't do that, do they? What they do is they get themselves out of the sun and get under the shade. And if I walk at midday, I'll notice all the cows and sheep in Cornwall Park are all under the trees. Now, no one tells them to do that. They instinctively know it's the right thing to do, right? Too much sun, dangerous. Not enough sun, dangerous. Right amount of sun, perfect. Right? So what they do is they go out, when they get too hot, they go into the shade. We should do the same thing, because they get their vitamin D from the same place we do, which is sunlight. Your immune system dictates whether you get sick or not, whether you get cancer or not, whether you get heart disease or not, whether you get diabetes or not, whether you get asthma or not, whether you get osteoporosis or not, is dictated by your immune system. What runs your immune system? Vitamin D. Key thing that protects you against cancer. Your immune system dictates whether you get sick or not, how regularly you get sick, how badly sick you get, and then how quickly you get well. All these 4 things run by your immune system. Now, how do you power up your immune system? With your diet, your lifestyle, and your environment. Completely and utterly dominate your immune system. So, in February 2009, George Ebers, a professor of clinical neurology at the University of Oxford, confirmed that a lack of sunlight directly affects a gene which significantly increases your risk of multiple sclerosis. And this was something that was presented for many years, and he was laughed at. He was literally laughed at in medical circles for suggesting such a thing until it was proven. And now, of course, it's taken as gospel. We know that, which is why the Scottish government, who've got the highest rates of multiple sclerosis, have suddenly started adding vitamin D to foods everywhere. You get fortified foods with vitamin D because they know that it's much more effective for us to put vitamin D into food and lower the levels of multiple sclerosis than it is to treat people when they've got it. It's far more effective. So we know and we see that the autoimmune diseases are much higher in those areas without enough sunlight. So this has been clinically proven now, is accepted in mainstream areas. And even when we think about skin cancer, a meta-analysis of 6 different studies found that smokers raise their risk for skin cancer by 50%. This was published in the Archives of Dermatology about 2 weeks ago, by 50%. So we know that a lot of the talk is all about sun causing skin cancer. It's actually not the case when you look at it. Now, does the sun cause some skin cancers? Of course. You get yourself burnt, you get fried, you can cause real damage, no question. However, there's so many other things that cause skin cancer as well. Smoking is one of them. Dramatically raises your risk of skin cancer. Your digestive tract harbours trillions of bacteria. We know there's about 100 trillion cells here, 10 times more than the rest of the human body. And it's the most influential part of variation in human populations. So if you get a group of African children and you compare them to a group of British children on the modern diet, and the African children living outside, running around, completely and utterly different makeup of bacteria in their gut. Completely and utterly different variation. We've seen how gut bacteria can influence a heart attack or bowel cancer. We know there's a direct relationship between your gut bacteria and whether you get a heart attack or not. Because your diet influences and changes and affects your gut and your bowel health. We know that. So what you eat becomes your genetic expression in the gut. Now what happens is the more oncogenes you have switched on, the higher the risk of cancer that you've got. The more tumour suppressor genes, the higher risk of health. Of course, what do tumour suppressor genes do? They suppress tumours. Because that's why they're called tumour suppressor genes. So the more tumour suppressor genes we have, the lower the levels of cancer that we've got. The more oncogenes are switched on, the more cancer. How do we switch those genes on? Our genetic expression. What runs our genetic expression? Our probiotic bacteria and bacterial population. What runs and feeds that? Our diet. So the diet has a direct relationship to the probiotic bacteria, to the genetic expression, to the genes either switching on towards health or switching on towards cancer, directly from your diet, which is why fruits and vegetables are so important. You cannot get a cancer cell occurring unless DNA is altered. When you drink alcohol, the acetaldehyde is corrupting the DNA of life and puts you on the road to cancer. One of the most common genetic defects in man is our inability to counteract the toxicity of alcohol. And that's from Dr. Nick Sharon, the liver unit, Southampton General Hospital. Now, if there's anyone you want to talk about what alcohol does to the human body, go and talk to someone working in a liver unit, because they will give you the reality check of what alcohol does. Because of course, once you get your once you get your liver sick with alcohol, of course your risk of death of cancer goes through the roof, because this is the one thing that will protect you and save your life. So when you start to look at it, what happens is every time you drink, you create acetaldehyde. That's just a biological reality. Now, it doesn't matter whether the wine that you're drinking is certified organic and blessed by the Dalai Lama. It makes no difference. Or whether it's Russian vodka brewed in someone's backyard. It makes no difference at all in terms of its creation of acetaldehyde. It's a biological fact that human beings must create acetaldehyde whenever they drink alcohol. So we know that. So this is what corrupts the DNA. So alcohol, I've got a nice little picture here of a dead person holding a whiskey glass. I thought you might like that. So alcohol damages your DNA. Alcohol gives you toxic bacteria, and we've just talked about how important your genetic expression is in your gut. So alcohol immediately gives you toxic bacteria. It raises your oxidative stress and raises inflammation. 3 key causes of cancer. There's damaged DNA, toxic bacteria, oxidative stress, inflammation. You raise those 4 things, you dramatically raise your risk of cancer. We know that. So alcohol is also the number 1 cause of sudden cardiac death for anyone aged between 40 and 60. Drop dead on the street, usually from drinking. In 30 years, our liver disease death rates have gone up, 85% due to alcohol, 500% growth. And your usual death from liver disease is in your 40s. Now, I'm 44 right now, so I'm a classic example of a male in New Zealand at high risk for death from a sudden cardiac death from drinking. Now, a good thing I gave up drinking 26 years ago. Yay! That puts me at pretty low risk, obviously. But I am the classic Kiwi in terms of that sense. Liver cancer, 98% die very quickly. Of course, once you get liver cancer, as we've talked about, your liver is going to save your life. You get cancer, it's all over. Alcohol is the number 1 cause of liver cancer. And the National Heart Foundation of Australia reviewed over 100 studies, and they looked at the studies that say alcohol is good for your heart. And actually, once they looked at it, they said, this is a load of bunkum. This is not true at all. This is manipulation of data. When you actually look at the alcohol and heart studies, they actually say you have a far higher risk of death, even if you're a moderate drinker. So when you start to take it apart, there's a lot of marketing. The study here, the Million Women study, looked at 2 million women studied for 30 years. And their statement at the end of that was, no amount of alcohol is safe for cancer risk. I'll say that again because a lot of people just cannot even hear me when I say that the first time. 2 million women studied for 30 years. The statement was, no amount of alcohol is safe for cancer risk. Because we know that every single time you drink, you create acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is a carcinogen at the same levels of toxicity as plutonium in atomic bombs. Acetaldehyde, plutonium, same level, class 1 carcinogen. So we know that alcohol is dangerous. So breast cancer and alcohol. We're now going to go into breast cancer and really have a swim around in breast cancer because it's something that's very topical, and I know for a lot of you, you'll have a high level of interest in. So let's have a look at alcohol and breast cancer. The Alcohol Association has been known for years as one of the most modifiable risk factors for breast cancer. This is from the Harvard School of Public Health. Your cancer risk increases with every drink, from Wendy Chen of Harvard. There is now evidence showing that any amount of drinking increases breast cancer. James Garber, University of North Carolina. The more you drink, the higher your risk of cancer. The less you drink, the less at risk you are of developing cancer. It's as simple as that. Now, this is a cancer epidemiologist studying cancer rates all over the world from Oxford University. From a cancer prevention point of view, it is best not to drink at all. It's that simple. Science Program Manager, World Cancer Research Fund. So these are a mixture of different professors and doctors with PhDs from all over the world saying exactly the same thing about alcohol and breast cancer. So what about breast cancer rates? Well, they've tripled in 30 years. The world's population's only grown 65% in 30 years, whereas our breast cancer rate's grown by 300%. How does that work? From 600,000 in 1980 to 1.7 million today. It was once a rich woman's disease, and indeed the actual name for breast cancer in rural China is rich woman's disease. That's actually what the dialect translates the name into, because only women with money that can afford Western foods get breast cancer. That's where the name came from. It's now the number one cause of female cancer death in the European Union, and it's the number one cause of death for Western women aged 40 to 55. And the famous Nurses' Health Study, one of the most rigorously followed studies in history, found that only 3% of breast cancer cases were genetic. So this is one of the most respected mainstream scientific studies. 3% genetic. Not 90%, but 3%. The Women's Health Study found the same thing. They found a sugar-rich diet raises your breast cancer risk by 135%. We talked earlier about how sugar grows cancer. Exactly the same thing. Sugar-rich diet, massive growth in breast cancer. 135%. Normally when you get a 10% increase, you start to freak out. 135% is a whole nother universe, whole nother level. So breast cancer and obesity, we know the England breast cancer rates have gone from 52 per 100,000 to 88 per 100,000 in the last 25 years. This directly matches the growth in obesity in England. Directly matches it. In 1960, 1 in 20 women were diagnosed with breast cancer. By 2012 now, 1 in 7. So we have this massive growth from 1 in 20 to 1 in 7 breast cancer cases in the West, particularly in New Zealand, Australia, the UK and the USA. The larger the breasts, the higher the risk. Obese women have a 180% higher risk. And in 1960, the average bra size was 10B. It's now 14C. So we have this huge growth of bra sizes as well. Funnily enough, I got this information from a very different source than I normally get my health information from. Quite funny, but anyway, I digress. So, breast cancer and estrogen. It was mainstream science, by the way. Excess body fat, particularly abdominal fat, and this is the part that really kills you here. Abdominal fat raises estrogen levels. Now, the more estrogen exposure that you have, the more you are at risk of breast cancer. So we know the more estrogen you have through the body, the more breast cancer you have. Now, if you have a weakened liver, and most people do, as we've talked about a number of times tonight, then the liver cannot process the estrogen fast enough. So what happens is if you can't process the estrogen, it's dumped back into the bloodstream. The body then recirculates it. So you're getting this recirculated estrogen going through the human body. Now the recycled estrogen is from the ovaries, from the fat cells, and from the overworked liver. So those are the three causes, of course, coming through the liver, from the ovaries, fat cells, you get this recirculation of estrogen. Recycled estrogen is up to 400 times higher in women with estrogen-sensitive breast cancer. So is there a link between estrogen levels and estrogen-sensitive breast cancer? Of course there is. 400% higher. Direct causality. That is the kind of study that is absolutely undebatable. Direct causality. So, breast cancer and genetics. The genes that heighten your risk of breast cancer are BRCA1 and BRCA2. Many of you will have heard of these genes. BRCA1 and BRCA2 are often talked about in the media. BRCA1 and BRCA2 are only in 1 in 500 people. So according to the American Cancer Society, BRCA genes cause 5 to 10% of breast cancer. So even the BRCA genes that cause the breast cancer, or they say that are high risk, they're only actually in 1 in 500 people. And they only cause 5 to 10% of breast cancer. The reality is your genetic odds of breast cancer are less than 1%. That's actually your genetic risk, is less than 1 in 100. However, we have 1 in 7 in New Zealand. 1 in 7 women getting it. Your risk is less than 1 in 100 genetically. So in a 2011 published Journal of Clinical Oncology study, this covered 3,000 families. And these families were from the Breast Cancer Family Registry. So these are women with BRCA genes in their family. So these are a woman that you would consider to be at the highest level for breast cancer. 3,000 families, all registered and followed, with high levels of BRCA genes. Now, even this study showed they were at no higher risk for breast cancer. Mainstream science done by professors and doctors and scientists showing exactly the opposite of what we've been told. Even those women with BRCA genes in the family, no higher genetic risk. So it's really interesting when you start to look at, well, is it genetic? Maybe not. So breast cancer and meat intake. New Zealand women are now eating 4 times more meat than they did in the 1960s, consuming on average about 300 grams per day. By the way, the British government announced, I think it was about 2 years ago, they recommend now the maximum meat you should eat a day is 100 grams. That was the maximum. It used to be 400 or 500 grams. They put it down to 100. I still consider that a ridiculously large amount of meat to be eating. However, New Zealand women, 300 grams a day on average. That's how much meat we eat. In 1978, if you looked at breast cancer rates around the world, you found in 1978, breast cancer rates were 82 times higher in America than they were Kenya. And a high meat diet versus a high plant diet. Women eating meat every day have a 200% higher risk of breast cancer, regardless of whatever else they eat. So even if you're eating a small amount of meat with lots of vegetables, you still have a much, much higher risk of breast cancer if you're eating meat. Japanese meat eaters have 8 times higher rates of breast cancer compared to Japanese vegetarians. And rural Indian women get breast cancer at a rate 400% lower than American women. So we can look at the different, and these are the epidemiological studies. When you look at groups of women, you notice their breast cancer rates are so different around the world. They're just astronomically different. And it's not about genetics, because you have women with the same genetics, but with completely different rates of breast cancer. A high meat diet also gives girls a 75% higher risk of having their first period by age 12. Now, why is that a problem? Well, we know, of course, with menstruation, that experiencing menstruation younger means a far higher risk of breast cancer, because the more that you have menstruation, the more that you have estrogen in the human body. Now, if you've got a weak liver and you can't recycle the estrogen or get rid of it, it circulates. Then you have more exposure to estrogen. The more estrogen you have, the higher the risk of breast cancer. Girls experiencing their first period at age 7 have doubled in the last 10 years in the West. It's the worst thing you're going to hear tonight in this whole presentation. Girls experiencing their first period at age 7 have doubled in 10 years. Now, I have a daughter, and I know many of you have daughters as well. I can look around the room, and I know a lot of your daughters. Now, if you look at a girl at 7 and she has menstruation then, and you compare it to having her at 12 or 17 or 18 or 16, it's a completely different psychological profile, as you're all aware. What we want to do is have girls with menstruation as late as possible for so many different reasons, let alone societal reasons. But that's what's happening. Girls on a high meat diet in England, Denmark, and the USA are now hitting puberty at ages 7 to 10, right around the Western world. This is happening all over the place. American girls on the high meat diet now have their first period at average age of 11 in the States now. That is the average age of menstruation. Rural Chinese girls on a plant-based whole food diet have their first period at age 17. So if you tell me that there's no difference between an 11-year-old and a 17-year-old, you're in la-la land. I have a daughter, I know what she was like at 11, and I know what she was like at 17. Now, if I had the choice, I would have had her first period at 17, just for the protective aspects it gives you in society. It keeps you away from all the unwanted attention that, it's hard enough to deal with as women, let alone as girls. So the difference between 11 and 17 is enormous. 6 years difference. High IGF-1 triggers menstruation. So if you want to know the things that trigger menstruation young, researchers in England have found that high levels of IGF-1 in the human body and other hormones in girls are associated with a much earlier onset of menstruation. So this is a lower onset of menstruation when you get your period. This suggests a genetically regulated trade-off with delayed reproduction but longer life that is at least partially mediated by IGF-1 by researchers. Now this is really interesting. Again, earlier I said that the genes that give you longevity are the same genes that grow cancer. We know they're very, very similar genes. So if you get a gene that's not giving you cancer, it's also going to give you longevity. So you get a double hit with it. Same thing here. So you get this genetic regulation where you have a period at an older age, which is what we're looking for, that then gives you longevity as well. So what we're wanting to do is have the menstruation at the oldest age possible, rather than the youngest age possible for longevity. So what increases IGF-1 at an early age? What is it that increases IGF-1? The typical modern diet is the most effective way to raise IGF-1 in the human body. High meat, high animal fat, high animal protein, and refined sugar-rich foods. Your typical New Zealand diet, right here. This is what raises IGF-1. So breast cancer and iron. Iron is another thing. Cancers are very dependent on non-bound free iron. Now, by the way, non-bound free iron is not the iron that you find in fruits and vegetables. So for instance, spirulina is a great example of vegetable-based iron. It's very safe, it's bound iron, it's very different. So plant-sourced iron are not free-bound iron. Synthetic iron pills is where you get free iron from. Excessive animal protein and alcohol intake increase your free iron in the human body. So they are the things that increase your free iron content. Iron in vegetables is beneficial and harmless, completely different sort of iron. It's called bound iron. And women who drink just 20 grams of alcohol a day significantly increase the iron in their breast tissue, particularly around the nipples where it tends to solidify, and have a much higher incidence of the most deadly invasive breast cancer directly from drinking alcohol. It seems to free up the iron and then send it to the breast. So again, one of the ways to lower that is to eat less red meat, because red meat is a very high source of non-bound free iron. Breast cancer and lifestyle. We know that smoking raises breast cancer as well by about 70%. Secondhand smokers, exactly the same. There's 150 New Zealand breast cancer cases every year just because someone happened to be around someone else smoking. Again, that's just one of the saddest things you'll ever read. 150 New Zealand breast cancer cases every year because you happen to be around someone else smoking. It wasn't even you smoking, and it caused you getting breast cancer. That's why I'm one of these fierce advocates for banning cigarettes from the planet. And it will happen in our lifetime. We will have countries in the world that ban cigarettes. Bring it on. Bring it on. People have no idea how damaging cigarettes are. They just do not understand. They think it's just lung cancer. It's not. It's catastrophically destructive on the human organism. It's the most effective way to kill human beings ever invented. You know how many human beings have killed just through first-hand cigarette smoke in the last 10 years? 55 million. 55 million human beings who have paid for the right to die young of a hideous disease. It's extraordinary. So, in Australia, it's about 2,500 cases of breast cancer a year from cigarettes. 2,500 every year in Australia. 6 hours sleep raises your breast cancer risk by 62%. So again, getting more sleep. You've heard me talk about sleep. I recommend getting 8 hours sleep a night. I think it's very, very important. The benefits seem to be between 7.5 and 8.5 hours sleep. Some women require 9, but it seems to be about 8 to 8.5 hours sleep is about perfect. So I recommend getting more sleep. And the sleep is, of course, from 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock. That's the ideal sleep. And yes, there is such a thing as beauty sleep. It's called going to bed at 9 o'clock. That's beauty sleep, if you want to know what it is. And it has been categorically, scientifically proven. You can actually measure wrinkles. You can measure beauty. You can actually have photographs taken of you after certain amounts of sleep, put in front of people, and people picking when you look the best. Every single time it comes down to the amount of sleep you have. So yes, it's been done over and over again. So the image and the acceptance of beauty and how good you look, directly relationship to how well you sleep and how much sleep you get. So one of those simple things tonight, if all you get out of tonight is to remind to go to bed early again, it's a huge thing, right? Because New Zealand women, they sleep 6.5 hours of sleep a night, and it's not enough. It's just not enough. It's not even close. So get more sleep. I recommend 10 to 6 or 9 to 5. 2 drinks daily raise your breast cancer risk by 40%. 2,600 Australian breast cancer cases from alcohol every year. So you can see how Australia is doing, off the chart with breast cancer. Extraordinarily high levels of breast cancer in Australia. And of course, they're drinkers like we are. They have the second highest rates of drinking in the world now. Sorry, third behind Ireland and the UK. So it's Ireland, the UK, Australia, and I think New Zealand's about 5th or 6th, I think, on the destructive alcohol abuse kind of area. Regular sunlight lowers your breast cancer risk by 75%. We know that as well. So there's no drug cure for breast cancer. We know that. There is no drug cure that's effective. And we know that 90% of breast cancer cases have no family history. Therefore, 90+% of breast cancer cases are not genetic. But what you hear in the mainstream media, of course, is breast cancer is genetic. My mum's got it, therefore I'm at high risk. The key thing to remember here, excuse me, I might have a glass of water. The key thing to remember here is with breast cancer, if your mother or your grandmother had breast cancer, then you share the same genes as they do. No question, half of you is the same genes as your mum, right? So if your mum had breast cancer, you've got a high risk of breast cancer if you live the same life and eat the same foods as she did. If you, however, change your diet and your environment and lifestyle, you annihilate your breast cancer risk. If you do the same thing she does and you have the same genes she does, you'll get the same genetic expression. No two ways about it. But do not fool that for genetics giving you breast cancer. It's your genetic expression giving you breast cancer. So it's how you play in the world. It's your diet, lifestyle, environment triggering the breast cancer or not. So breast cancer risk could be decreased by up to 38% just through lifestyle factors, including maintaining a healthy weight, exercising regularly, and eating a healthy diet. For prevention of breast cancer, limiting alcohol to 1 drink a day, which is far more than I recommend, by the way, 5 ounces of wine, 12 ounces of beer, or 1.5 ounces of spirits is one of the most important things that you can do. In addition, a plant-based diet loaded with at least 2 cups a day of a variety of produce is beneficial. This is Sally Scroggs, University of Texas Anderson Cancer Center, one of the leading cancer hospitals on the planet. Even their advice, mainstream medicine, cut your drinking right back, eat a whole lot of fruits and vegetables. Doesn't matter how you want to swing it, it always comes back to the same things with cancer. You must change your environment. So in Western society, we have a high animal-based diet. We have refined sugar-rich foods. About 25% of us are overweight. We've got a sedentary lifestyle. We avoid the sunlight. We don't go out in the sun. We kind of think it's sunlight that's dangerous, so we avoid it. We have a high alcohol intake. We have about a 20% smoking rate, which in New Zealand, by the way, is dropping, which is fantastic. We've got something like a 15% rate with teenagers now, which has dropped right down from about 24%. It's wonderful. So we are getting somewhere. And we sleep about 6.5 hours a night. And we have very low levels of breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is very important for breast cancer prevention. Very important. So 1 death per 12 women. This is what we have in the West. So when you look at all the things I've gone over, and I've given you little bits of research on all these things tonight, we've talked about the animal-based diet, we've talked about sugar, overweight, we've talked about sedentary exercise, we've talked about sunlight, we've talked about alcohol, we've talked about smoking and sleeping. We haven't talked about breastfeeding, but that's another thing that has an impact. So these are the things that we do in the West. Western society, we have 1 death per 12 women. So in rural China, when you actually study rural China, this is when the statistics go off the chart. You have a plant-based whole food diet. You have whole foods which are rich in fiber. You have 0% overweight. They walk everywhere all day long. They're on their feet the whole day. They live under sunlight. They don't run away from sunlight. They have a low or zero alcohol intake, very low levels of smoking, if at all. And they sleep 8 hours a night. And they have breastfeeding for 1 year. Why? Because that's all they can do. They have to do it, right? Because they're forced to do that in the society they're in. So when you look at what we've got here, we've got animal versus plant, sugar versus whole foods, overweight versus underweight or healthy weight, sedentary versus movement, avoiding the sunlight, living under sunlight, high alcohol intake versus low or zero alcohol, 20% smoking versus low smoking, not enough sleep versus sleep for 8 hours, low breastfeeding versus breastfeeding for a year. Do you know what the difference in breakdown is? 1 death per 12? It's 1 death per 10,000. So it's completely and utterly different because of the lifestyle factors. Now here's the thing, if you take Chinese women in Western society, they have that. It's just not about the genetics. You can remove Chinese women from rural China, put them in Western society, their rates will be the same within a decade. So it's not about genetics, it's about genetic expression. Genetic expression is from diet, lifestyle, environment. That's what you have control over. So again, the good thing is we do have the control. So cancer and fasting. It's another thing that's great for cancer is fasting. Dr. Max Gershon has used juice fasting for decades with fasting people. And when fasting, your cells show significant declines in their tendency to proliferate. Now, what is one of those things I talked about with cancer growth is proliferation, right? Progression, promotion, proliferation. That's how cancer grows. What happens when you fast is your cells slow down in their proliferation. And of course, when you fast, the cancer cells got nothing to eat because there's no sugar. And that's what they grow on is sugar. And of course, you immediately increase your oxygenation of the human body when you're fasting. So lots of oxygen, which cancer cells hate, and low levels of sugar, which cancer cells hate. And not enough food, which cancer cells hate, so they can't proliferate. Hence, fasting is incredibly effective. Tumor cells lack the ability to turn themselves off. That's why they progress. So when you're fasting, of course, healthy cells get into like a hibernation type mode, which gives extreme resistance to chemotherapy and stress. So it's wonderful in that sense. Cancer patients have fewer side effects when they're fasting, when they're getting treatment. And in one study, no animals survived when they were fed normally while given chemotherapy. However, 60% of fasting animals did survive. Now, as I said earlier, if you get a study on a drug and a drug therapy and it gives you a 5% survival rate, everyone considers that a massive success. 5% is like, this is great, we've cracked something, 5% is amazing. 60%, completely off the chart. The only difference was the animals were fasting. Same group of animals, one were fasting, 60% survival versus nothing. That's how powerful fasting is in terms of what it does for the human body. So it protects healthy cells from chemotherapy, it stops cancer cells from proliferating and increases your protection against the effectiveness of the drugs. So it protects the healthy cells from the damaging effects of the drug that you're taking. It also stops cancer cells from growing, so it actually stops the cancer growth from proliferation, starves them to death essentially. It increases the chemotherapy effectiveness. So all three, it's just a home run. It's why fasting therapy is so important when you're going through cancer treatments and so widespread. Added sugar, we know, feeds cancer. And I've kind of done a bit of a summary here where you actually can sum it up by saying too much sugar gives you excessive insulin, of course. The body pumps in insulin to transfer the sugar to the cells. Then you get low blood sugar and you scream out, I'm starving. You crave the fatty, sugary kind of foods. You then get into sugar addiction. And then you get high sugar diet, feeding that cancer growth. Then, of course, you feed the cancer growth, you get into malnutrition because the cancer's eating up all the glucose. Then you get into weight gain, inflammation, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, early death, all from added sugar. That's how it works. From the top down, this is how it works into killing you young, which is why sugar is one of those things, again, I recommend that you don't add. High sugar intake doubles bowel cancer risk. And of course, New Zealand women eat the most meat in the world and one of the highest sugar-rich diets with low-fibre diets. And it's that three combination, low fibre, high meat, high sugar, grows cancer, particularly bowel cancer. Cancer also gives you liver-toxic drugs. All drugs are liver-toxic. So some drugs are appropriate and they should be given, and that's great, and drugs have their place for sure. But just remember, they're all liver-toxic, so they will all be damaging your liver. And if you've got a fat, weak liver, then you're in trouble. 30% of adults, as I've said before, have got liver disease, fatty liver disease. Now, if you divide the grams on a label by 4, that gives you an accurate sugar teaspoon count. So a lot of people don't realise that's a simple way before you eat anything at all. Divide the grams on the label by 4. That'll give you how many teaspoons of sugar is in it. Now, one of the interesting things is recently in America, some of you may be aware, I've been doing a bit of blogging about this. I'll be doing a huge blog tomorrow on this about cola drinks and the rates of obesity in America and the fights. And they've got, in New York at the moment, Mayor Bloomberg is trying to stop the selling of the really large size soft drinks. Some of you might be aware of this in the media. Now, these large size soft drinks that he's trying to ban, do you know how many teaspoons of sugar they have in one? 87. 87 teaspoons of sugar. Now, this is a drink that's designed for you to drink at once. Do you know why? Because it's got a straw and it's got a lid on it. It's not one you put in the fridge and seal. This is a serving with 87 teaspoons of sugar. That's what they're trying to ban. Oh, I don't know, it's huge. A couple of litres probably. Extraordinary. So that's what they're trying to ban. Now, is that a bad thing? No. That sounds very smart to me. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? And there's all this uproar in America about freedom of rights. And it's unbelievable. So, an apple versus a hamburger. This is a nice way of showing you the difference between what an apple will do in the human body versus a hamburger when it comes to cancer risk. You need both fibres. You want your bowel cancer to go away, you need both fibres, soluble and insoluble. Soluble goes into the liver, grabs all the cholesterol and the fat, and moves it into the bowel. That's what soluble fibre does. It moves that fat into the bowel. Insoluble grabs that and creates a bowel motion. Gives you the poos, right? So number one, grabbing the liquid and turning it into liquid, removing it into the bowel and giving you number 2. Both fibres are in an apple, for example. And of course, funnily enough, yesterday there was a study released on ursolic acid, which is another compound found in apples, which is anti-cancer and anti-obesity, just discovered yesterday, released in a big press release. Pectin and polyphenols. Pectin very effective for anti-breast cancer, and polyphenols as well. High levels of prebiotics. And what do prebiotics do? They feed your probiotic bacteria. Now that gives you good genetic expression, which lowers your risk for cancer. Enzymes and carotenoids. What are carotenoids? Carotenoids are antioxidants. What is the thing that I said that stopped the cancer cells communicating? Antioxidants. So apples have antioxidants that stop them communicating. So it stops the cancer cells growing in the liver. It removes them from the bowel. It protects you from breast cancer. It gives you a better genetic expression. It lowers the risk of communication with cancer cells. It's GMO free. It's 100% natural. Contains about 60 cofactors that feed the human body. Stimulates disease prevention genes. Lowers cancer rates and lowers asthma rates. All in one apple. That's what an apple a day will give you, which is why an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Right? That's where it comes from. And that's from human experience. We now scientifically know what's in apples. But our human experience has been the people eating the most apples live the longest, happiest lives. Apples are a superfood. Absolute grade A superfood. Even in cancer protection and cancer prevention. Wonderful. So let's compare it with a hamburger. So these are the things that we know that we need to protect ourselves from cancer. So what about a hamburger? Well, it's got no fibre, no plant nutrition, no prebiotics, no enzymes at all. It's 100% processed, has no living cofactors, has a negative genetic effect, no oxidative effect at all, and causes cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So you can see that when you're looking at a treat, do I eat an apple? Do I eat a hamburger? Do I eat an apple? Do I eat a hamburger? Which one do I choose, right? Choose the apple, okay? There's no debate here. No debate at all. One will literally put you down the path towards dying young painfully. The other one will protect you from exactly that. Here's the other thing. Apples are cheaper than hamburgers. Superb, right? Absolutely superb. So, what is agreed on cancer? What do we know? We know that inflammation is at the heart of cancer growth. So keeping inflammation down is critical. We know that. We don't want inflammation. What keeps inflammation down the most effectively? Fasting. A plant-based whole food diet. We know that oxygen destroys cancer. We've gone over that tonight. Where do you find oxygen-rich foods? Regular fasting, plant-based whole food diet. We know cancer hates an alkaline environment. What creates an alkaline-rich environment? Sunlight, relaxation, lowering your stress, plant-based whole food diet, fasting. Dr. Contreras, highly successful doctor in treating people with cancer, one of the most effective natural doctors treating cancer and literally curing people of the worst kind of cancers, the kind of cancers when we say you've got to go home and die. That kind of cancer, what does he recommend? A high-fiber, plant-based whole food diet is the best. Direct quote from him. And he is literally curing people of cancer. So you look at it from any different perspective, you get the same result. Even the American Cancer Society, one of the most conservative societies in the world, they released their 100 studies released since 2006. They looked at all of them, they reviewed them, and then they made a statement. So Colleen Doyle, the Nutrition and Physical Activity, made a statement, the director. There's just been an explosion of research in this area that gives us the confidence that these things matter, as in your diet. These things matter. These studies really spell out the benefits of weight control, of physical activity, and of a healthy diet rich in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains in terms of recurrence of cancer, reducing mortality of cancer, and improving your survival if you've got cancer. Bottom line, consider what you're eating. Get your nutrients as best you can from food. This is from mainstream cancer research. They're talking about the most important things are what you do, not your genetics and not drugs, but what you do as to whether you get cancer. What do they recommend now? What do the American Cancer Society recommends? Eat a plant-based whole food diet, low in red meat, low in saturated fats, low in alcohol. Number 2, move your body every day in a variety of ways, i.e. do what turns you on exercise-wise. Whatever it is that you like to do, go out and do it. Walking particularly. Reach and maintain a healthy weight via diet, lifestyle, and portion control strategies. Regular fasting. Brilliant. Fast once a week. Your entire intake of food over the week drops. Portion control strategies. So, as we start to finish up this evening in this particular presentation, there's a couple more slides I wanted to go over. This one particularly I like because it's a raw food pyramid. Now this slide, I just want to clarify, this slide is not about saying you must eat all raw foods. That's not what I'm saying. As you know, on the program that we've got, we recommend raw foods, sprouted foods, fermented foods, and cooked foods. There's 4 different food groups. We recommend all of them, a nice mixture. In New Zealand, we eat way too much cooked food, so we tend to try to educate you to eat more raw, sprouted, and fermented. However, we want to eat all 4. What this is about, though, and what I really like about this particular slide, is it really gives the right mixture of foods and the mixes of how we want to eat them. We want to have a lot of leafy green vegetables. This is what we're genetically made to eat. Lots and lots of leafy green vegetables. Secondly, fruits and vegetables, good whole fruits and vegetables, and this is where we get our sugar from. This is where we get our sweet flavors from, is whole fruit. Now, is there a picture in here of a cola drink? No. Is there a picture in here of fruit juice? No. There's only pictures here of whole fruits and vegetables. That's where we get our sugars, which gives us our glucose. Now notice that when you're eating fruits, you get a much lower amount of sugar and a very high amount of fiber. So it slows down the whole delivery to the human body. So cancer cells can't get all excited about too much fruit, right? Because it doesn't give them enough glucose. And of course it's rich in oxygen, which cancer cells hate. Your liver loves. So again, lots of fruit. Sprouts and legumes, of course, the richest source of antioxidants, the richest source of living digestive enzymes and prebiotics for your gut is in your sprouts and legumes. Nuts and seeds, hemp seeds, fats, things like that, flax, microgreens, spirulinas, things like that. So small amounts of the super rich foods here, your herbals here, your gingers and things like that. You know, you have small amounts, you might have it regularly, but your overall intake is quite small. And here, this is where you put your animal protein. So if you're wanting to eat animal protein, which I don't recommend, but if you're wanting to eat that, have it in about this kind of amount. Small amounts here as opposed to larger amounts of your fruits and vegetables as you're eating it. Because of course animal protein and animal fat has no fibre. And of course we're at the highest risk of bowel cancer in New Zealand. It kills more of us than per capita than any other place in the world. So let's go over as a summary for this evening, how to cause cancer. So what are the things we know that cause cancer? Well, smoking, number 1. Don't do that. There's lesson number 1 for this evening, don't smoke. Number 2, drinking alcohol causes cancer. We know that, dramatically causes cancer. Being overweight or obese causes cancer. Eating processed animal foods directly causes cancer, particularly breast cancer and bowel cancer, which are the 2 worst that New Zealand women have. And of course, what do we get? Where do we get it from? Processed animal foods. Refined sugar-rich foods, very, very high for cancer. Feeds cancer. As we talked about, the anaerobic mechanism of cancer cell growth is fueled by sugar-rich foods. Soft drinks, fizzy drinks, soda drinks, cola drinks, energy drinks. All the kind of fizzy yucks, avoid them like the plague. A high-stress lifestyle. Getting stressed, getting wound up. It's one of those things where we get a lot of people eating well, but they cannot control their stress. They start to grow sickness in the human body. So whatever it takes for you to be relaxed, get time out every day. If it's just reading a novel, if it's going to bed early and reading a book, if it's having a bit of meditation, a bit of yoga, walk on the beach, whatever it is, it's really important. You know, we call it you time or me time. Get some. So get some every day and have it as a priority for your health. Seriously, it makes a huge difference. You've got to have downtime. You've got to be able to let the stress go. A sedentary lifestyle, so that will raise cancer, not moving enough. A lack of sleep, we've talked about a lack of sleep. Being constipated obviously dramatically raises your risk of bowel cancer. Fried foods and the bad kind of fats, the saturated kind of fats and the trans fats. A toxic environment, so obviously if you're living in an area where there's lots of aluminium in the walls or there's lots of, toxic chemicals in the environment, that's a toxic environment that you're living in. And then you've got the stress on top of that. And being resentful, bitter and angry as well. So carrying what they call emotional baggage. It can literally eat you up from the inside, where we get people getting sick literally because they're so angry or wound up at the world. That kind of thing. So whatever you can do to get rid of that is a good thing to do as well. Plant-based whole foods. So let's look at preventing cancer. So number one is plant-based whole foods. We know that. Myriad of science about it. Fresh raw vegetables. Literally, if you can base half your diet on fresh raw vegetables, you will virtually annihilate your chance of getting cancer. If you're eating about half of what you're eating, fresh raw vegetables, you will annihilate your cancer risk. Broccoli, watercress and cruciferous vegetables, very important group. Anything to do with cruciferous, and I know there's a number of people in the room here growing their own vegetables, wonderful, even better. If you can grow your own and pick it fresh, absolutely knock a home run. Soaked raw nuts and seeds, very, very high levels of soaked nuts and raw seeds in those groups of people that have low levels of cancer. So the Mediterranean diet is very high nut rich. The Okinawan diet is very high nut rich. The Loma Linda diet is very high nut rich. So they have a lot of nuts and seeds. And what do they get from that? Of course, they're essential fatty acids. And what do you get from essential fatty acids? Anti-cancer compounds. So again, eating lots of those good nuts and seeds lower your cancer risk. Staying slim and fit, so getting yourself in shape and staying fit is very important. A daily, vigorous 1 hour walk in the sunshine, and I mention sunshine here because, of course, what we're lacking is vitamin D, and this is where we get our vitamin D, is the sunshine. And even on a crappy Auckland day, you can still get a little bit of sunshine occasionally. So when the sun pops out, try to whip out, sunbathe, get a bit of sun. You don't have to strip off to your bikinis in the middle of Queen Street, but you can just get a little bit. And yes, it doesn't matter where it hits you on the body, even if it's on your hand. Okay, you can get enough sun on hand, so you don't have to expose the entire body. Sleep 8 hours every night. Fast regularly on fresh vegetable juice. Just take a day off every week or every second week. I know a lot of you are fasting regularly. It's a wonderful thing to do just to get into that habit. Very important. Feeding your probiotics. How do you feed your probiotics? By eating prebiotic-rich foods. What are prebiotic-rich foods? Raw, sprouted, and fermented foods. They're the only foods that contain living digestive enzymes and prebiotics. Raw, sprouted, fermented. That's why I go on and on about them all the time. Now, you can eat cooked food as well. Absolutely. So, eat all four. Eating sprouts, really important. Get some sprouts into you regularly, particularly mung sprouts, really, really good. And big part of the Japanese Asian cuisine, of course, is mung sprouts. And relax and find happiness. So find some things that you really enjoy doing, and you can cross that over with your meditative time as well. But emotions have such an impact. Such an impact. In my book I write, there's a whole section in my book about how your emotions have an impact on your disease rates. And you can look at it from longevity to heart disease to cancer to kidney disease to liver disease to brain disease to mental decline. The happier people live longer with lower levels of disease. So again, find things that you like to do and do them. So the two quotes I'd like to finish up on tonight before I hand you over to Tracy is it takes about 15 years from the first bowel cancer initiating DNA damage to full-blown bowel cancer. So the earlier we improve our diets, the better. And that's when we talk about being pre-ill and when you're going to die, is you want to get onto making sure your bowel is clean as soon as you can, because it takes 15 years to grow. That's why suddenly people wake up with bowel cancer, or they wake up with a sudden surprise heart attack. And 1 in 4 people, when they get a sudden surprise heart attack, do you know what happens to 1 in 4 people when they get a heart attack? They die instantly. 1 in 4 Kiwis, when they get a heart attack, instant death. It's the first sign of coronary disease they have, is that they die. So we want to avoid that. How do we do that? By getting onto it early. Latest research says it takes 15 years or so to grow bowel cancer. Bowel cancer in New Zealand is off the chart. So it's possible that once discovered, the mechanisms of cancer will be shown to be absurdly simple and measures of control will readily follow. Well, here's some mechanisms of cancer that are absurdly simple. Eat less, regularly fast, eat a plant-based whole food diet, get exercise, lower your stress and find some relaxation. Those 5 things utterly and completely transform your risk of getting cancer. Just those 5 things. It's that simple. So yes, I love this quote because it says, you know, once discovered, the mechanism of cancer will be shown to be quite absurdly simple. It is simple. It's really, really simple, and the science is there already. It's just there's not much money in me saying fast, because no one buys any food. Right? So there's not a lot of money in it, but that's how it works.